What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. and Matthews, break down all the original content you watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock. And today we're finally getting to the Cody Rhodes episode of Broken Skull Sessions from back in May 6th, 2022 to be exact. This was a doozy, almost 2 hours in length. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I mentioned, reviewing this and getting to it and watching it to review it way back when, 4 months ago. So, took me a long time. It's been an incredibly busy summer. I'm happy I finally got to it. This was great stuff. So let's get right into it. They open up the episode with Cody and Steve Austin, obviously, who host the fucking show, talking about their love for IPAs, and Cody finally got to taste Steve Austin's IPA, which I've had in my hands before. Alexis's father actually didn't buy one. A friend of ours got it for him. I don't drink, so I didn't drink it, but I heard it was all right. That was before Cody showed off his Rolex, and he was like, well, he goes off on this side story, which was a really fascinating story about how Dusty told him when he was growing up, you can't wear a Rolex until you win a world championship. And he was notorious for wearing Rolexes, because Dusty Rhodes, obviously, throughout his time in NWA and whatnot, won his fair share of world championships in wrestling. And he even shared, Cody did, that Dusty actually pawned off that same Rolex at one point to pay for Cody's acting classes, either before he got to WWE or in the midst of his WWE run. I forgot exactly when, but very interesting story there. And Cody's wearing the Rolex now, and he kind of feels bad because he hasn't won the World Championship in WWE yet. But listen, he won a Rolex, or he won a World Championship. He didn't win a Rolex, but he did win a World Title in Ring of Honor, so that's got to count for something, right? They talk about their love for bourbons and how Cody just filmed the show pilot recently. I forgot what it was called. When it's coming out, if it's coming out, I have no idea. But then he gives Austin 3 bottles of wine, which was really cool. Nice gift there. So then they get right into it. The WrestleMania 38 return, they watch the entrance, they watch a portion of the match, the finish. Cody it looks like you can visibly see him getting goosebumps when he says that he never thought he would see his American Nightmare logo on WWE TV. And I think he speaks for all of us when he says that. He kind of felt like he was in a trance walking down that ramp. Cody told WWE, personnel, officials, commentators, whatever, going into that night, please do not mention Stardust if it's not necessary. Please don't make a big point about it. And he's okay with it being brought up in certain situations, like a heel putting heat on themselves for it. I'm not sure if Rollins brought it up much, if at all, during their promos and the build-up to their various matches in the spring. It wasn't really alluded to a lot. Obviously, he did the Stardust fucking cartwheel at WrestleMania. Beyond that, though, didn't do a lot of Stardust references, which was by design. Steve Austin praises the match. Obviously, that was the same show that Steve Austin returned to the ring at WrestleMania and had that great moment in the main event. And he was watching that Cody entrance and match, and he loved it. For Cody, he said that it could have easily been a freebie. People were telling him, oh, this is a freebie. It's not really about the match. He didn't want it to be just about the moment. He wanted it to be about the match as well. And he loved the match that he had with Rollins. Rollins is a wrestler. And he felt that night was the biggest thing he has done so far. And he looks at that as a positive, as a compliment to himself. But it could also be a negative. It ends up being the biggest thing he ends up doing in WWE. And he doesn't want that to be the case, of course. And hopefully it won't be if he wins the World Championship at some point. As far as the fans cheering him or booing him, that was a pretty hot topic of conversation with Cody towards the end of his run in AEW. As someone who is a Cody Rhodes fan and has been a Cody Rhodes fan for well over a decade now, pretty much since I started watching wrestling in 2008, I thought the stuff in AEW he was doing towards the end, not the matches he was having, but the character work and some of the feuds he was having, were some of the worst fucking shit I have seen him do in the last 15 years. And not all of that is his fault, but it seemed like a lot of it was his fault, like feuding with fucking QT Marshall and the Sammy Guevara feud I wasn't a fan of, although I liked the ladder match that he had, that he went out on in late January before his contract expired. That was great stuff. But yeah, I thought everything Cody was involved in, specifically in 2021, was just fucking awful. Getting Brandy involved was not a good idea. He did not work well as a face towards the end there. He was at his peak, in my opinion, in 2019, mid-2020 with the TNT title open challenge, even though there weren't a lot of fans in the building for that, which was unfortunate. But anyway, he talks about how when he came back, he didn't know if people like Michael Hayes and Vince and the powers that be in WWE, if they knew what the American Nightmare was or who he was all about with that character. Regardless, he felt like he got the ball at WrestleMania, and now he's ready to run with it, and it took him a full 24 hours to fully appreciate and enjoy that moment from WrestleMania 38. He talks about being first introduced to wrestling when obviously his father, Dusty, was wrestling, and at his peak as the world champion and whatnot. His mom told him he didn't have to be a wrestler, but he also noted that his parents did not really present him with other options. And he was always proud of his dad, and Dusty was never insecure about who he was as a person, what he looked like, which is great. Dusty did worry. The only time he worried about Cody getting into the business and breaking into the business was around the Attitude Era, because that was the time that Goldust was in WWE, that Dustin was in WWE, doing some really dumb shit. And Dustin had a very good run as Goldust overall, but some of the shit he was involved in like 98, 99, I don't know how long he was there before he got canned or left or whatever, but some of it just was not good. And I don't blame Dusty for being worried about that. But Cody, meanwhile, was very successful at amateur wrestling in high school, and he wanted to shut up the non-believers that thought that what his dad did was fake and that he couldn't follow in his footsteps. And he could have very easily gone to Penn State and other colleges with a full ride, probably, due to his amateur wrestling success. And he said no, he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and never had any doubts about getting into wrestling. Actual, like, pro wrestling, not amateur wrestling, I guess. I should clarify that. He mentions he started taking pro wrestling bumps around the age of 15 at Dusty's school or whatever he owned at that point. And he wasn't allowed to work matches, but he did with the people from the power plant that came over after the doors shut. When the training facility closed officially for the day, that was when Cody was working like fake matches and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. Al Snow was his primary trainer, which is awesome. And he feels like he could have used more time in developmental in Ohio Valley Wrestling. And he also mentions how the word over is a very misused term. He says that a lot of people in wrestling today, including himself, are not over, but they're trying. And it takes years to achieve that after selling out buildings, people like The Rock and Stone Cold. It takes a long time to get to that point. And he says the word over is probably misused, not only by fans, but probably the talent themselves as well. But he mentions that, you got to trust your own instincts, and he's the first one at this point in his career. If he was 20 years old, he would do exactly what Ricky Steamboat told him to do. But now that he's around 35, he's of the mindset now, all right, I appreciate the advice. I'm going to go out there and do wrestling as I know wrestling to be. But if I'm wrong, I'll be the first one to come back out here and tell you I was wrong and you were right. So that's his mindset in the whole wrestling thing, of course. He talks about how when, Dusty being champ and whatever, and actually going back before that, he mentions how the Hall of Fame in 2007, when Dusty got inducted, came actually during tough times for the family when they weren't doing well financially. Dustin was there, Cody was on stage, he gave this great speech for his father. Dusty had already returned to WWE right before that at about a perfect time when they were going through tough times financially, and he got to work with Stephanie and Paul Heyman on SmackDown in 2005. And Cody mentioned that his Hall of Fame speech, his promo as people called it, led to him getting called up quicker. He was already in the developmental system. He debuted soon after on the Raw roster, like within a matter of months, because officials were so impressed by his promo. They thought he was main roster ready. He didn't think so, but he made the most of it. He also talks about Dusty getting heat for booking himself as champ, all this other sort of stuff. Before getting into his Raw debut in 2007 against Randy Orton. That was his first official match on WWE TV, was against his eventual mentor in Legacy, that being Randy Orton. He recalls how nervous he was, and he was happy that he was introduced as a rookie, because rookies are allowed to make mistakes. So he was happy he wasn't presented as this big deal being Dusty's kid. Yeah, he had the lineage, but he had a lot to learn, and they presented him and portrayed him as such on the show, which was the right route to take, he feels. But the next day, he got asked for his autograph at the fucking airport, and he immediately felt famous, which was funny. He thanked Steve Austin for the WrestleMania 38 house, and seeing him, his face plastered all over the stadium, going into that show, he felt, man, what do I got to do to be in that spot? That's the spot that he aspires to be in. Then he gets the Legacy from 2008-09, my favorite period, one of my favorite periods of Orton's career, because I started watching around the time Legacy became a thing. Literally within a few months of me watching Raw regularly was when Cody and Ted became a tag team on Raw. So I loved all the talk about Legacy here. And he mentions how Randy Orton really valued being the leader, and management really attempted to pit Rhodes and DiBiase against each other and kind of put them at odds in an attempt to really grow their careers and make them bigger stars. And they kind of got to a point where they didn't like each other because of that. But he also mentioned that they probably obviously smoothed it out and they're fine now. But he mentioned how the group was actually supposed to be bigger. And that I can believe because there were points in late 2008. DiBiase left for about a month or two. He got punted in the head by Randy, came back, thought he would turn face, people did, but then immediately joined up with Randy, and they kicked Sim Snuka out of the group, and Manu as well. Manu was there for a few months. Sim Snuka was not in there for very long. I think he might have been considered for a spot. Either way, they bumped him out of the group and kept into the three of them. And the idea to keep it to the three of them came from Randy himself. He wanted to fully focus on Cody and Ted, knowing they were indeed the future. From there, he talks about how he loved working with Shawn Michaels. He learned a lot from DX during that feud in the fall of 2009. And he really feels that Legacy should have gone on for another year. Realistically, it only went on for about a year and a half from like the fall of 2008 to the spring of 2010, and they split around that point, heading into WrestleMania 26. He feels they could have gone for another year. I don't know about that personally. From a developmental standpoint, probably to help out Cody and Ted. But Randy was ready to be on his own again as far as like from a viewer television character standpoint. And Legacy had dominated Raw throughout 2009. All the run-in finishes got real old for me as a fan, even 15 years ago. So personally, I was ready for Legacy to be over and for them to move on. But he feels it could have gone on longer. But they were basically there towards the end to help out Randy as a babyface. He got white hot as a face. He got over white hot as a face. The thing was, the initial intent of the group was to launch the careers of Cody and Ted. Cody obviously is in the spot he is now, but it didn't happen overnight the way they thought it would. And Ted ended up kind of floundering and getting released in not getting released, but he left on his own terms in 2013. But nonetheless, it was very cool to hear him talk about Legacy. He talks about dashing promos and how they were written by one man. And he does not name that man, but we all know that one man was Vince McMahon himself. And he didn't want to endear himself to the audience or do ha-ha. He mentioned this whole story that he had with Big Show. And they were feuding late 2010. He told him he didn't want to do ha-ha, and Big Show said, well, get yourself over then. And it was at that point he realized it was part of the process. But, he used what he learned from the acting classes years earlier, and ran with that. He ran with the gimmick, made it his own, and was happy that he wasn't, for the first time in his career, labeled as Dusty Rhodes' kid. They then move on to the March 2011 feud, the Rey Mysterio heading into WrestleMania. I almost said Extreme Rules, but they had a match at Extreme Rules as well, heading into WrestleMania 27, where, he had the face mask, and he put a lot of pressure on himself during that time in his career because he thought it was some of his best work. And honestly was. The mask shit, Cody, I get the sense he doesn't have the greatest creative ideas because he said later on that he wanted this to go on a lot longer than it did. And it went on for a long time. I mean, he donned the mask for the first time in like February of 2011, and he held on to that thing until fucking like November. And by that point, it was well past its prime. It was really dumb. He was ready for the next step by that point. It seems like he really likes to drag shit on. But anyway, he talked about how he used inspiration from Bateman's character in, Christian Bale's character in American Psycho, and Phantom of the Opera as well, which was pretty obvious. He wanted to keep it going, like I said, but also winning the Intercontinental Championship was a dream of his, and he was happy he got to accomplish that. He mentioned how the whole point of the gimmick was that he had a mental problem and not a physical problem with his face. From there, they rewatched the WrestleMania 27 match with Rey Mysterio. Great match. He picked up the win. His first singles match on pay-per-view, if you can believe that. And he actually asked about getting the old Intercontinental Championship design back, and he got his wish. They actually acknowledged that and gave him back the old Intercontinental Championship back in October of 2011. And people brought it up to him, like people in the company, hey, why wouldn't you want your own design? Because that way the merch money goes back to you, because if they make more, if you sell replicas, then the money goes back to you because it's your championship. And honestly, he was more obsessed with the nostalgia, and I'm happy he was, because that belt is great. I don't know if he wanted his own Cody Rhodes custom title, that would have been fucking dumb. I think the whole custom title, for the most part, that whole thing to me is stupid. I'm glad they didn't do that. That is the superior design to me. I only own one replica championship, and it's that one. So I have Cody Rhodes to thank for that. And he just talked about that being the belt that he grew up on, and how it was the Workman's Championship, the Workhorseman's Championship, and he really wanted that title, and he got it. And it ended up lasting for, 8 or 9 years? They held on to that championship, I think, until 2019. So they held on to that title for a very long time, and with talk of there being new belts in WWE, they'll probably move forward and not backward, but I would really like if Triple H brought back that old championship, because it was the superior design with the white strap, at least in my opinion. Anyway, so from there they talk about, he talks about secondary championships making them matter. And that run really made him feel like he was next in line for the quote-unquote big picture, that being a main event push. And honestly, though, yeah, he got his own hopes up because no one told him that. That was in his own mind. But honestly, he's not wrong, though. He was ready for that next step by 2011 because he had that. 2011 was probably his peak in WWE. And by 2012, he was ready for a real, at least, shot at the main event scene that he never got. And they still had 2 world titles by that point. They still had a brand split, so they could have done it. Maybe not put the championship on it, but they never even tried. Like, he was still stuck in the mid-card. What did he even, he got put in the Damian Sandow tag team, which was entertaining, but, it went on for too long, and they ended up feuding, and I think 2013 was really when they should have pulled the trigger on his babyface push, but again, they didn't. They had him team with Dustin, and it just never really came to light, which was just unfortunate, because they really felt like you could have been the next Mr. Money in the Bank, and it just never happened for whatever reason. But anyway, they rewatched the Battleground 2013 match with himself and Dustin, Goldust, whatever, against the Shields, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins. One of my favorite Cody Rhodes matches ever. That match was amazing. 2013 overall was an abysmal year for WWE, but that one match was absolutely phenomenal. He talked about around that point, he wanted to move away from the Rhodes legacy, but he was happy he had that moment because it was one of the final times on air anyway. They were all together at the same time, and it was just an amazing moment, an amazing match. He talks the Stardust run and how it was supposed to originally be Silver Dust and how it peaked in 2015 with the Stephen Amell feud, which it probably did. I mean, that was some pretty good stuff with the Arrow stuff heading into SummerSlam, and from there, I thought the Stardust stuff sucked. I really did. But he even said that he wasn't ready to be Cody Rhodes again after his father passed in 2015. Everyone, myself included, was saying, oh, you got to go back to being Cody Rhodes. His father has passed. Why not pay homage to that? He feels personally he was not ready for that. And maybe they pitched it to him and he said no. I'm not sure, he didn't say that here. But he did think in real life he thought he would have more time with Dusty before he passed. So they talk about his passing, and he mentions how Dusty would always say he didn't want to be an old man. That wasn't his identity. And he never really got a chance to process his passing until actually he left the company in 2016. And he didn't get emotional for 6 years, and he's gotten emotional recently on Raw talking about it, earlier this year. And people thought it was an act. The real act, he said, was not getting emotional, intentionally not getting emotional about it for 6 years leading up to 2022. He shares the advice that Brody Lee actually gave him about his own dad passing 10 years earlier and saying that it's okay to not let go, and it still feels like yesterday my dad passed. And I never really truly got over that, he said about Brody, which I thought was really cool given his own passing. And Cody was able to relay that same message to Brody's kid, Brody Jr. But he mentions how Dusty's getting his own A&E doc, very happy about that. I would assume one of the biography documentaries, probably coming out in the second half of this second season, or first season, whatever the hell it is. They just did a whole batch. Dusty was not among them, so I assume that's next year that's going to be coming. But he mentions he was supposed to become Cody Rhodes again in 2016, and maybe he said this elsewhere, but I mean, he was Stardust for 2 fucking years. By the end there, he was ready to move on as far as maybe not personally, and it sounds like he was, but from a fan standpoint, we were all ready, all right, this Stardust shit has served its purpose, he's not even with Goldust anymore, it's time to move on, and they just had him stick with the Stardust shit. So he wasn't ready in 2015, but I guess he was ready in 2016 based on what he was saying here. And he thought it would happen a lot quicker than it did. It did not happen soon enough to his liking. And honestly, I can't really blame him for that. So he put out a statement releasing himself essentially on Twitter. And even right before that, a talent relations person was like, oh, see you next week. And Cody said, no, you won't. And he even calls it a very unprofessional way to go out, but he felt like he had to go. And he was embarrassed by Stardust by the end there. He wouldn't, when he did meet and greets, he would stay in character because he didn't want to be Cody and admit that he was Stardust. And he was glad that it went down the way that it did. And it was actually Kevin Owens who was the one who told him how much he could make on the independent scene, realistically, with where he could go and what he could do, because Kevin Owens just came off of that life prior to arriving in WWE in 2014. Big Show hooked him up with his agent, who's still connected with Cody to this day. And Cody's intent was to work in every independent promotion in the country. And it worked a lot differently than WWE, where in WWE you would have this loop in the same area. On the independent scene, you would go from working in LA on Friday to then New Jersey on Saturday, at least the way that Cody Rhodes did it. So, and he was all about that life, and he was very happy about it. They actually showed the list that he put out following his WWE departure in 2016 of all the people he wanted to work with. Adam Cole leading that list, and Mike Bennett, among other people, Moose, the Bucks. He ended up having matches and doing everything that he wanted to from that list, aside from Roderick Strong. Because at the time that Cody had left WWE, Roddy was preparing to go to WWE, like literally right after that. And he left Ring of Honor, I think, in June or July of that year. So they never had a chance to have a match. But he does tease the match with Roddy, who, as of this recording, still works there. I know he requested his release at one point earlier this year. But maybe it's a match that we could still get at some point when Cody is good to go and healthy and whatnot. So anyway, he said that he was told that he needs a new list for WWE as far as people that he wants to work in WWE and whatever. He talks about dyeing his hair blonde and how Austin was a fan of the change and how it really completed the Cody package. It was actually Zack Ryder, a.k.a. Matt Cardona, that told him to get out of his comfort zone with a lot of what he was doing on the independent scene. And that's why the Bullet Club stuff was the perfect fit for him, because he was like the antithesis of the independent scene at one point. He was prime sports entertainment, to the point where him joining Bullet Club was perfect. They were a heel group, the hottest thing in wrestling. It was the perfect story, especially with the way that they told the split and the tension with him and Kenny Omega in 2018. And it was around that point, with the stuff they were doing after some of the Ring of Honor shows and the New Japan shows and the indie shows, that he felt something bigger was happening. And they talk all about All In. And the tweet that led from Meltzer to All In becoming a thing, the challenge, so to speak, and Cody took it on as a challenge. It wasn't a direct challenge from Meltzer. And he knew they could do 10,000 tickets. They did. It was an awesome feeling. He praises the match that he had that night for the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship with Nick Aldis. And he calls that show a moment in time, which it was. And he wanted to show with that show that wrestling can also be an alternative, because it featured talent from Impact, Ring of Honor, New Japan, Lucha Underground, and all these other promotions, where a lot of these talents were, kind of getting their feet wet and getting exposed to a bigger audience. And he wanted to show these are people that either are no longer in WWE, about to go to WWE. We want to showcase some of these people, which was really cool. So he shares this story about meeting up with Austin at the Long Beach show that New Japan did in 2017, the night that Cody faced Okada, which was a pretty good story. He talks about still getting used to now transitioning out of the EVP role. And while he was EVP, he was proud of that time, but he was hands-on with everything, and he was very overly generous in his own words as far as putting other people over and stuff like that. The highlight of his AEW tenure, he says, was his match with Dustin Rhodes. And I got to agree, that match was incredible. I was there for it in Vegas. Awesome stuff. He says that was the match that made AEW. He even heard from, he said the man himself, I don't know if he was talking about Tony Khan or like an executive at Warner Media, I don't know, but an important figure told him this was the match that made AEW. That was the match that stole the show, and that was the show that had Omega and Jericho in the main event. But after that, he kind of saw himself go down the same road as Dusty, as far as, like, Dusty was the champion at many points when he was Booker, and people thought, oh, he's putting the belt on himself, which he kind of was, but he was also on top because he was over. And Cody was over, but they didn't put the championship on him. Now, I'm not saying they should have cut Jericho's reign short. Jericho was amazing at that point, but they most certainly, when I say they, I mean Cody, most certainly should not have done that dumb stipulation to where he could have never challenged for the championship again. That was really stupid at that point in his run. And I know why he did it, he's explained it, but it ended up being very stupid in retrospect. But he felt like it was a good role for him, like at 45 and not in 35, so it just wasn't the right time for it. And even Arn told him, hey, you got to get some for yourself. You got to kind of get your own shine sometimes and not just put everyone over. But he felt AEW was his baby and that AEW didn't really need him anymore. That was his thought process. He did not want to become, which he already was at that point, a gatekeeper wrestler. Where, I mean, honestly, part of that was his own problem because he put in place that stupid stipulation where he couldn't challenge for the World Championship. That was his own doing. I mean, if he didn't put that stipulation in place, he probably would have won the world title. I mean, I know Tony Khan had his own idea of who he wanted for the first 4 world champions, so maybe not. But by now, maybe, if he was still there. But nonetheless, he was feuding with Malachi Black when he came in, and Anthony Ogogo, and Andrade El Idolo, and all these other people that would, Lance Archer in 2020, people that would come in, feud with Cody, kind of get their feet wet with him, Brody Lee being another one, and then Cody, I mean, he would go over in the end sometimes, and usually he did, I mean, to be fair, but he would always kind of stay at that same level. He kind of hit a wall in AEW. So honestly, leaving the WWE was the best thing he could have done. It was the best thing he could have done at that point in his career, that being earlier this year. But when Steve asks him why come back to WWE, the one primary reason he mentions was, and he points to the Wing Eagle belt behind him in the Broken Skull Sessions studio. He wanted to win the WWE Championship. He mentions that Bruce Pritchard was the first one to make contact with Cody upon his departure from AEW. Pritchard didn't think the whole thing was real. No one thought it was real. A lot of people thought it was a work or that he was going to go back. And he's like, no, it's real. I'm gone. And they met in person soon after that, and it was off to the races from there. He talks about his first convo with Vince and how they kind of connected human being to human being and how he felt that he should have had that conversation with him when he left back in 2015, 2016. And he could not have wrote a better comeback story than, like, his last WrestleMania was at AT&T Stadium. Coming back to that same stadium, a much bigger star 6 years later was the perfect story. Working with Dusty's kid in storyline, that being Seth Rollins, the face of NXT at a certain point. The perfect comeback story. Even in AEW, his first match on Dynamite was with Sammy Guevara. His final match there was with Sammy Guevara, putting him over for the TNT title, which was a pretty great way to go out. I'm not a big Sammy fan at this point, but that was a great way to go out for Cody. They kind of fucked up that momentum, but anyway, that's another story for another day. He emphasizes that wins and losses matter, and he previews his WrestleMania Backlash match with Seth Rollins, which was great. Obviously, that's already happened. That was many months ago, and he won. I was there for that match. It was great stuff. And I was there for the Mania return, too. I've been to a lot of shows this year. And he explains the wrestling is a love story tweet, and how wrestling is indeed a love story for fans and everyone else involved in the business. And he, found out who Cody Rhodes was at WrestleMania 38 when he returned. He's going off his gut from here on out. Steve Austin admitted that he questioned his decision to leave in 2016, that being Cody's, but he's very proud of him for everything he's accomplished since then. So that capped off a very good conversation. Great stuff here from Steve Austin and Cody Rhodes on Broken Skull Sessions. It's about 2 hours in length. If you're not a big fan of the territory talk, it does get a bit not dull, but if you're not a big fan of there's a lot of Dusty talk. So if you're not a Dusty fan, only care about the current stuff, you'll probably skip through that. But it's an awesome conversation overall. I would never recommend skipping over a Broken Skull Sessions. They're all fascinating in their own ways. And this being one of his first major interviews after coming back to WWE in the spring, it's well worth the watch even all these months later, especially now that he's currently gone out with an injury. And it makes you miss Cody Rhodes that much more and want to see him back on the sooner side. Hopefully in time for WrestleMania, where it can knock off Roman Reigns for that undisputed WWE Universal Championship. That being said, guys, thank you so much for checking out this review. I appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G.S. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.